Hello, welcome back to this reading of Through Water and Fire by me, Matthew Wainwright. This is my book and I'm reading it. It's a Tudor book set in the world of the Tudor court in England about 500 years ago, and it follows the story of Grace Summerford as she moves to Lockwood Hall and finds out about the mysterious goings on there. We've just finished chapter 5, where we've met a mysterious, balding, short, wiry stranger in the woods, and Elizabeth and Grace are just facing off against this man. And we've got a clue to who he is in the title of chapter 6, which we're going to read now. And the title of the chapter is just John Turner. For a moment, the three of them stood in shocked silence, each as surprised as the other. Before the balding man had a chance to move or speak, Elizabeth positioned herself in front of Grace, shielding her with her body. "Hornwell!" Elizabeth called sharply. With a rush of snapping twigs and breaking branches, Hornwell burst into the clearing behind them, his own weapon drawn and ready. When he saw the man, he strode forwards, gently ushering the girls aside. The man regarded Hornwell cautiously. He had not lowered his weapon, but neither did he take up a fighting stance. Instead, he stood on his guard, ready to fight or flee as the occasion might demand. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," the man said. His voice was low and reasonable, but it had an oily quality that made Grace shudder. "Why don't you put up your sword, sir, and I'll put up mine, and we'll talk this through like gentlemen, Hornwell did not move. "You're no gentleman, sir, if you speak to a lady with a naked blade in your hand. I'm no gentleman either, but if you try me, you'll find me to be a soldier. Speak your business or depart." Grace huddled close to Elizabeth, her head spinning with the speed with which events had turned. She could hear the horses nearby gently snorting and shaking their heads. If they made a run for it, Hornwell could hold the man off, and once she was on Artemis, there would be nothing between her and Lockwood Hall but open countryside. She was about to whisper this plan to Elizabeth when there was another rustle, then another, and two more men stepped into the clearing. They were taller than the first man, their faces harder, their shoulders broader, and though their own swords were sheathed, their cloaks were swept back, bearing the hilts in readiness. When the bald man saw them, he relaxed, even as Hornwell stiffened, weighing the new odds and finding them out of his favour. "Well," the man said, smiling ingratiatingly, "now we're all here, why don't we dispense with the posturing and use our words rather than our blades? Elizabeth stepped forwards again. If she was afraid, she did not show it. She kept her head high and proud and addressed the man in a steady voice. "I'll ask you again, sir." She snapped the word as if addressing one of her brothers who had been caught sneaking into the kitchens. "State your name and business or else leave. Your manner is insolent and your speech unbecoming. I will not be addressed in this way." The man gazed at her for a moment, then he burst out in a shrill little laugh. My, he said, "you don't mince words, do you?" With a swift movement, he sheathed his sword, then took a step back and bowed low and elegantly. "John Turner, at your service. And these are my, associates, both called Simon. They're twins, you see, and it appears their mother never could tell the difference between them, so she named them alike to save herself the bother of trying. Not that it matters. Call the name and either will come. Or both." Grace took another look at the two men standing to either side of Turner, and sure enough they were identical in every feature, from their black brows to their crooked noses. The one nearest to her turned his head and returned her look with a flat, empty stare. She shivered and quickly lowered her eyes. "A fine story, Mr. Turner," Elizabeth replied, "but you still haven't stated your business. These are my father's lands, and as far as I am aware, you have no warrant to walk them with a blade." "Your father?" Turner raised his eyebrows. "So your father is Gregory Lockwood of Lockwood Hall? Well, why didn't you say so in the first place? Simon," he addressed the two hulking forms, "stand at ease. These are no vagrants nor common folk. You are in the presence of the daughter of Lord Lockwood, my lady." He bowed again, and this time he held his head low as he spoke. "I beg of you 1,000 pardons for my behaviour and my speech. I had no idea who it was to whom I spoke, nor that I was in the presence of nobility. I crave your forgiveness, if you will grant it." He paused, still bowing low, waiting for permission to rise. Grace would have left him there. His words were fine, but they rang hollow. She had the suspicion he was making fun of them. Elizabeth, however, was more forgiving. She brushed down her skirts and nodded graciously. "Rise, Mr. Turner. It was no more than a misunderstanding, and there is nothing to forgive." "Your ladyship is very kind." Turner straightened up and inclined his head, first to Grace and then to Hornwell, who returned the nod with a flat stare. "Is his lordship at home?" Turner asked. "No," Elizabeth replied primly. "He is away on the king's business. But my mother, I am sure, would be happy to receive you at table. My father's steward can discuss your business if you would like." Too kind," Turner murmured. He was rubbing his thumb and forefinger together in an unconscious motion as he studied the group. "We have had a long road, and our feet are weary." "You did not ride?" "We took ship to Blakeney, and from there we determined to walk to Lockwood Hall. It was while we walked that we saw your company dismount at this copse. Alas, we were too far away to discern who you were, and so we exercised caution as we approached. Again, you must forgive my presumption. My business is such that it makes me naturally suspicious of isolated meetings." "And just what is your business, Mr. Turner, if I may be so bold?" "Why, the protection of the realm," Turner replied with a smile. "When I meet your mother, I shall be more than happy to illuminate you further." "Very well," Elizabeth said. "Grace, let Mr. Turner take Artemis. You can ride behind me. Mr. Turner, if you accompany us, will your men mind following on foot?" "By all means," he said, bowing low again. He followed them through the trees, leaving the two hulking Simons glowering after them. Grace felt an irrational distaste at the thought of Turner riding Artemis, but she held her tongue and climbed up behind her cousin in silence, and they cantered across the fields towards the beckoning lights of the hall. Dusk was deepening when they clattered through the archway into the well-lit courtyard. Immediately the stable boys swarmed about them, taking halters and bringing boxes for the ladies to climb down. More than a few eyebrows were raised at the sight of their visitor, who leapt from the saddle and looked around approvingly. But no one said anything. They would discuss him in minute detail that evening in the servants' quarters. As Grace dismounted, the hall door swung open and Lady Lockwood appeared, gliding serenely through the throng. Bodies parted before her as she made directly for Turner, who, recognizing her as a lady of high status, immediately bowed low. "Your most humble and obedient servant," he murmured. Lady Lockwood accepted the bow with a gracious inclination of her head. "You are welcome to our house, Mr." She glanced at Elizabeth for some kind of introduction. "Mr. John Turner," Elizabeth blurted. "Mr. Turner." Lady Lockwood smiled in her strong, sweet way. "You must join us for our evening meal. May I ask what fortune brings you to us?" Grace was becoming accustomed to the ways of speech in a family like this, and so she heard the unspoken words meant only for Elizabeth. Who is this man, and what is he doing here? Elizabeth heard them also, and lowered her eyes, rebuked. I serve Thomas More, my lady, Turner said, and at the mention of the name, Grace, who was watching and listening intently, saw some of the gentleness leave Lady Lockwood's face. I have letters of warrant from him to investigate unsavoury activity in these parts. Unsavoury? Lady Lockwood's eyebrows crept up her forehead. Criminal, my lady, if I may speak plainly. The eyebrows remained where they were. I see. Well, I regret that my husband is not at home, else he would be able to assist you. Our steward, Benedict, acts in his stead. He will meet you after supper, and you may discuss your business with him. Turner bowed low again, and Grace thought how slimy and slippery he seemed, like the fish she and Hannah had caught last summer, which had flapped and thrashed on the bank and wriggled its way back into the river before they could lay their hands on it. Your ladyship is most kind, Turner said. I am indebted to your hospitality. It is freely given. The words were polite, but Lady Lockwood's tone was not. There was something about this man that set everyone on edge, though he seemed oblivious to it, and stood smiling as Lady Lockwood beckoned to one of the boys in the crowd surrounding them. Kindly show Mr. Turner to one of the guest rooms so that he may refresh himself before supper and bring him down at the bell. Turner bowed low once more, and she accepted the bow with a nod of her head. I look forward to the pleasure of your company. That seemed to be some kind of signal. The crowds dissipated, everyone returning to their work, and Turner followed the boy into the house. Very quickly there was no one left but Grace, Elizabeth, and the stable boys. Come on, Elizabeth said. She was looking in the direction Turner had gone, and she seemed distracted. Let's get changed for supper. Supper was a grander affair than the small family meal of yesterday evening. Like breakfast that morning, it was held in the great hall, which again was crowded with the household staff, who lined the long tables and laughed and talked at the tops of their voices. A musician strummed on a lute in the corner, trying in vain to be heard over the din. Lady Lockwood presided over the meal at the high table on the dais, entertaining her guests. Turner and the two Simons, who had turned up an hour after their master, were seated on her right, and her children on her left, in descending order of rank. Elizabeth, Grace, the twins, and Agnes. Benedict sat on the far end of the table next to the Simons, keeping an eye on proceedings and beckoning servants now and then to direct the flow of food and wine. Lady Malvern, Felicity, and Miss Smallwood had been relegated to the head of one of the long tables on the floor, and Grace found it hard not to take satisfaction in Felicity's sour expression at being so deposed. Elizabeth hardly said a word. She had not spoken while the two of them had changed, and now she picked distractedly at her food, lost in thought. The Simons sat tight-lipped, saying not a word through the whole meal. Turner, on the other hand, hardly stopped talking, keeping up a one-sided conversation with Lady Lockwood, who smiled and nodded but barely replied. Grace managed to pick up the odd snatch as the din in the hall ebbed and flowed, Turner's words punctuated at regular intervals by an involuntary rising hum that made Grace's skin crawl. Hardly able to keep track of such people. They do tend to work in the shadows, but of course that's their manner. One would hardly expect them to behave as ordinary decent folk. Orders to search ships coming and going from the port for any contraband literature. Though one does wonder exactly how they're managing to get the books out. It certainly can't be by road. Otherwise the carts would have been stopped and searched by now. Entirely seditious, of course, and Contrary to doctrine, the mad monk, Herr Luther, he's to blame for it all, calling for an uprising before long, I shouldn't wonder. Do these people really consider themselves to be above the laws of God and man? And so on, almost without pause. Turner ate while he spoke, gnawing on the choicest portions of pork and pigeon and spitting bones onto the floor. Grace could not help watching him, captivated by the sheer inelegance of the man. Her own father was no longer a gentleman, but he knew how to carry himself like one, and how to speak like one too. Gracious and generous, and interested in the affairs of others. Turner spoke only about himself and his own business, and never once asked Lady Lockwood for her opinion. The worst was yet to come, however. Once the meal was over, the family retired to the parlour for conversation and entertainment, and to Grace's dismay, Turner went with them. He sat sprawled in a chair by the fire, his legs spread wide and his chin on his hand, his eyes darting around the room and lighting on everything in it like a fly flitting about. Every time they came to rest on Grace, she shuddered and looked away. Even the man's look was grubby. "You have fine daughters, my lady," Turner said, addressing Lady Lockwood. She was doing her best to listen to the soft melody being plucked out by the lutist, who was finally able to play to an appreciative audience. "How old are they?" "Elizabeth is my eldest, but one," Lady Lockwood replied fastidiously without looking at him. "She is just 16 years of age. My firstborn, our son, Andrew, is at court. He is now 18 years old. The twins are 8, and Agnes, my youngest, is 5 years old." A son away at court, and at home 2 girls and 2 boys. Turner made a show of counting them off on his fingers. "And yet I count 6 children here, not 4. "Grace is my niece," Lady Lockwood said, gesturing towards her. "She has come to stay with us to learn the art of service to a lady. Felicity is the daughter of my lady-in-waiting. She, too, is learning the art of service." "A noble pursuit," Turner said. He flashed a yellow smile at Grace, singling her out as the more senior of the two. "Would you like to go to court one day, little girl? Maybe you would like to serve a queen." Grace shuddered under his gaze. She returned his look in silence, having no idea what to say. Thankfully, Turner kept talking without waiting for a reply. "I have been at court many times in the service of my master, Sir Thomas More. I was at Greenwich Palace not long ago. Such a noble place, fitting for the best of princes and the defender of the faith. Heaven itself could scarce have more beauty." "I imagine the beauty of heaven far outstrips our feeble efforts on earth," Lady Lockwood said, rescuing Grace from having to reply. She spoke through gritted teeth, with none of her usual easy familiarity. "Quite so, quite so." Turner laughed and rubbed his finger and thumb together. "Though you cannot deny our king has been uncommonly blessed. Such wisdom, such great intelligence. Have you by any chance read the pamphlet His Majesty wrote against the mad monk Luther, for which His Holiness the Pope granted him the title Defender of the Faith?" "I have." "Did you not find it to contain arguments of the most elegant persuasion?" "I found it to be, as everything our king writes, uncommonly perspicuous." Grace watched in fascination. There was some kind of duel going on between the two of them, and though their weapons were words instead of swords, they were cutting, thrusting, and parrying with all the skill and determination of 2 combatants. Turner was pressing Lady Lockwood, and she was flicking away his probing questions with increasing irritation. "Of course," said Turner, There are those who seek to undermine the king and to lead him down paths other than those which are convenient to his majesty's moral and spiritual health. This new woman, for instance, the witch who has ensnared him with her spell, they say she whispers all manner of heresy in his ears, heresy she learned at the French court. Do you know, I have even heard she reads the Holy Scriptures in English, as they have been translated by that villain Tyndale. At this last remark, Lady Lockwood stiffened, but said nothing. Turner continued, watching her closely. However much that witch is determined to corrupt the mind of the King of England, her schemes shall fail. Every day we are rooting out heretics and sinners, cleansing the highways and byways of their filth. Just this last week, we intercepted a consignment of illegally printed translations being smuggled on a ship through Blakeney. The captain has been arrested and will shortly be put to death for his crimes. The agent he was meeting has, alas, eluded our grasp for now, but he will burn when his time comes, as the books were burned, and as every heretic shall burn in hell. Lady Lockwood rose suddenly to her feet. "It is late," she said, "and you must be tired from your travels, sir. I shall retire now. If you have any business, conduct it with Benedict. Good night to you. Girls, come." She gathered Agnes and the boys to her and swept out of the room with her ladies in tow, and the older three hurriedly curtsied to Turner and followed her. As Grace left, she took one last look back over her shoulder at him and saw him smirking contentedly to himself, rubbing his thumb and forefinger together. That was our introduction to John Turner. And eagle-eyed people, listeners, may have noticed what he said about intercepting books in Blakeney Port. So cast your minds back to the prologue and what happened there, and maybe start to put some of it together. Well, thanks for listening. I hope you're going to come back next week for Chapter 7 as the plot thickens. And I'll see you then. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.